Well, hello, welcome or welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at which careers are best suited to you based on your personality. So if you're new to the whole topic of personality, then definitely check out some of my more recent videos where I've done a deep dive into the various traits, where they come from, what they correlate to, and how to find yours. So the way this video is going to work is we're going to go through a bunch of different careers and actually show the personality breakdown that seems to align with that particular career. So then based on that, you can kind of work out your own personality and see if it aligns with this particular career. And that should give you some indication either whether you're in the right career, which career you should be aiming for. And obviously there's no guarantees here. There's always going to be outliers, but at the same time, it at least should give you an idea of your relative strengths and weaknesses. So just a reminder, we're going to be looking at the Big 5 personality model, but more specifically, the Big 5 aspect scale. So this includes all 5 of the Big 5 personality traits, but also the 2 sub-traits that belong to each one of them. So jumping straight in, we're going to start with a doctor. Now a doctor is defined by multiple traits, but primarily conscientiousness, because you need to be able to first of all get through med school, which is generally quite a tough and arduous process. But in addition, even the day-to-day life of a doctor is fairly taxing with long hours, a lot of physical and mental strain. So you have to have that high work ethic, high conscientiousness to have a chance of even doing well. And obviously the more hardworking and the higher level of industriousness and orderliness generally facilitates a successful career in the space of medicine. Apart from the trait of conscientiousness, it also helps to have relatively high openness. But out of the 2 sub-traits of openness, it's intellect that's particularly useful when it comes to being a doctor. Not only because it gives you an increased appetite when it comes to knowledge and information, but also it helps orientate you towards problem solving and trying to get to the bottom of things, which when it comes to almost any field of medicine is going to be a good thing. Intellect at the end of the day is your proclivity towards abstract thinking. So when it comes to tangible and real life experiences you have day to day as being a doctor, you have to be able to relate those to some kind of abstract concept, or even when it comes to diagnoses. Beyond these traits though, there are 2 others that I think help, but is not absolutely essential. The first being high agreeableness, but particularly compassion. I think on some level it helps because it allows you to relate and care for the patients who you're looking after, but at the same time, it's good to have some level of emotional distance between them, because if you're too high on compassion, you might not actually be able to operate effectively as a doctor, particularly under emergency conditions. The other trait that could be particularly useful is having low neuroticism, because when it comes to the intense medical scenarios that you often find yourself in, like emergency ones, it's helpful to not get too emotionally affected by the various things that you experience. So when it comes to low neuroticism, what this really means is having low volatility and withdrawal. Although I would argue that volatility is the more important one here, because withdrawal is more about future thinking, whereas you really need to be focused and not too emotionally affected when it comes to in-the-moment scenarios. Moving on to the next role now is an artist, and this could be an umbrella term for any kind of creative worker, but I think it helps to think of this as a stereotypical term because an artist is going to be mainly defined by and correlated with the trait of aesthetic openness. Obviously, there are many different types of artists, performers, and creative workers, and the other traits apart from aesthetic openness will vary somewhat depending on which type of category you belong to. So for example, if you're some kind of public performer, then you're more likely to have higher extraversion. Whereas if you're more of a solo artist who likes to spend most of their time alone in a studio working, or immersed in nature, then you're more likely to have lower extraversion and be more introverted. Intellect can also be quite useful here, as it can give you a range of different abstract ideas to work with and to try and communicate through, but at the same time, it's mostly through aesthetics that's going to define your ability and aptitude towards art. Some may say it's useful to have low neuroticism as an artist, but I don't think this is particularly true, as sometimes if you have higher neuroticism, this will make you more emotionally volatile, and then maybe you're able to communicate some of those emotions through your art, like many artists in the past have done. The next role we're going to cover is military personnel, and this is defined by a few things, but one of the main ones is having high orderliness. Having high orderliness is particularly useful in the military, as you're more likely to be neat and tidy, but even organised, and these things are very much demanded and appreciated when it comes to the training, the boot camps, but even out in the field, where you're more likely to be detail focused, a perfectionist, and all these details really matter when it comes to executing a mission to the highest possible standards. Again, I also think low neuroticism is particularly useful as you're going to be dealing with some potentially traumatic scenarios, and your ability to emotionally distance yourself or not get affected by them could be key to the success of that mission. When it comes to extraversion, I think it's the assertiveness component that's particularly useful, especially if you're some kind of military leader, but even if you're not, I think having the ability to be blunt about your current circumstances, your situation, and not be worried about what people are going to think of you in some kind of desperate scenario is going to be particularly useful. Finally, we have the trait of openness, and this is a particularly interesting one as it varies depending on what your role actually is. So if you're someone who is making decisions particularly away from the battlefield, then it helps to have a relatively decent level of intellect, as the kind of decision making, knowledge absorption is going to be particularly relevant and useful. Whereas if you're actually on the field, then I think in some ways having that higher intellect and proclivity towards abstract thinking may even be a burden. People with lower intellect or openness tends to focus on what's directly in front of them, as opposed to trying to figure out what this all means in a grander sense. And this is particularly useful as a foot soldier on the battlefield, because you don't want to get caught up with the greater meaning and figuring out what this all means in abstract terms, but rather focus on the actual details of your mission and your environment. The next role that we're going to be covering is a politician, and again this is defined by multiple traits, but first and foremost we have high extraversion. This is particularly important because you're going to be facing the public and your fellow co-working politicians in many different scenarios, so you have to have that natural appetite for positive emotion and putting yourself out there, otherwise it's going to become too mentally draining if you're too much of an introvert. Other traits include having high levels of conscientiousness. For obvious reasons, it's going to be long hours and heavy demands, so you have to have that appetite and willingness to go through and work hard. Also, I think it helps to have high intellect, as you need to figure out what the various abstract problems that your community or country has, and then only through being able to formulate those problems properly are you able to then figure out what the optimal solution is, or at least the best trade-off. Agreeableness is an interesting one, because in theory having high levels of agreeableness and compassion is going to orientate you towards helping people, especially your community, but at the same time having a sufficiently low level of agreeableness could be useful because that'll help you overcome the various public scrutinies that you're going to experience in the media and so on. The next role we're going to cover is a scientist, and again this is a pretty broad term, but at the same time one of the traits that's most core to being a scientist is having high openness, but particularly high intellect. This should be obvious when you think about it, as intellect is very much related to curiosity, and curiosity is one of the main driving forces behind the scientific method and trying to figure out the world around you. Other than that, what matters is having high conscientiousness, having a high attention to detail, and a strong work ethic can definitely increase your chances of being a successful and capable scientist. The next role is being a teacher, and this is made up of several traits. I would say the main ones are having high extraversion, high conscientiousness, and high compassion or agreeableness. Firstly, we have the high extraversion. This is particularly important because the combination of the high enthusiasm and assertiveness is particularly good in a crowd setting where you're trying to control and teach a class, but also the high conscientiousness is particularly useful because that work ethic is going to facilitate success in the classroom. And then finally, the compassion, being orientated towards the well-being of your students, is also something that complements teaching overall. The next role we're going to move on to is the entrepreneur, and again this is made up of several traits, but I would say one of the main ones is having high openness, both in terms of aesthetics and intellect, as these will both become the driving forces towards creative and entrepreneurial success. After that, we definitely want to have high conscientiousness, as having a strong work ethic and attention to detail is pretty much a must when it comes to operating a successful business. And then beyond that, I think having low neuroticism is particularly useful, as in any kind of business venture, there's going to be catastrophes and situations and fires to put out. So I think having that low neuroticism, low volatility and low withdrawal can definitely help in those circumstances. The next role we're going to move on to is an engineer, and this could be any kind of engineer, including a software engineer, but one of the main things that is a requirement for this role is having high conscientiousness, particularly high orderliness and that high attention to detail. Apart from that, I think it's going to be particularly useful to have high levels of intellectual openness, as problem solving requires analytical thinking and a willingness to try and solve these problems in as much detail and depth as possible. Also, having lower levels of extroversion definitely won't hurt you, and in some ways it might even be a good thing, and this is certainly confirmed by the stereotypes where we have software engineers or any other computer-based role where the person is typically quite introverted and even some cases socially isolated. So what I've covered so far has been a broad set of pretty distinct roles, but now I want to do more of a quick fire round where I go into roles that have some overlapping traits with the ones covered so far. The first of these is the accountant, and in many ways this is going to overlap with the engineer, where they have high levels of orderliness, conscientiousness, higher levels of intellect, perhaps lower levels of aesthetic openness, and the extraversion side of things, this could be somewhat variable, but particularly lower in enthusiasm is pretty common when it comes to accountants. The next one is a nurse, and in many ways this does also overlap with being a doctor, where we have high levels of orderliness, industriousness, low levels of neuroticism, but at the same time I would say the compassion side of things is cranked up even higher. The next one is a journalist, where we have high levels of intellect, high levels of assertiveness, moderate to high in industriousness, and agreeableness can be somewhat variable depending on what type of journalist this person could be. The next one is an athlete, and this is very much going to be determined based on your conscientiousness, but more specifically your industriousness, as training and discipline are essential for physical performance. I would say also extraversion, being high in assertiveness, can be particularly useful because competitive sports often requires confidence and leadership. Neuroticism and emotional stability is an interesting one. On the one hand, I think it's good to have low neuroticism and having that ability to cope in the face of various different challenging circumstances, but at the same time, if you're able to channel those emotions in a positive way, then maybe it's not such a bad thing overall. The next one is a pilot, and this is very much going to be related to having very high levels of orderliness, because that strict adherence to protocols ensures the safety of both the crew and the passengers. I'd also say having very low levels of neuroticism is particularly important and relevant because remaining calm under pressure is vital when it comes to navigating the various obstacles that you'll face when being a pilot. So I'm going to leave this lesson video here, but if you have any questions, or even if you'd like to know the personality breakdown of a role that I haven't covered in this video, then definitely let me know down in the comment section. But more importantly, if you enjoyed this kind of video, then I'd really appreciate if you could like and subscribe, and definitely keep an eye out for some of the future videos around personality and much more. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.